With this short video, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about regionalism, and specifically NAFTA and the environment. This is the third or one of three videos designed to prepare you for the WTO simulation later in this semester. And what I want to do with this video is talk about regionalism and the environment. In the other videos in this short little series, these primers for our simulation on trade and the environment, you'll hear discussions about the role of the multilateral trading system and its connection to the environment, the rules that apply to environmental or conservation management, and so you'll hear a fair bit about that in those other videos. And the experience with that probably dates, in my opinion, to the mid-1980s, late 1980s. But I would like to make the argument that the real source of entrenching the environment and trade, linking those things formally together, was really the 1992 presidential election and the debate around the ratification or the approval of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which in late 1992 was entering its final stages. Now, I just want to point out that the 1992 presidential election was fairly cantankerous. In this slide here, you see on the right one of the presidential debates, and you had Ross Perot as a kind of maverick third-party independent candidate, essentially siphoning off eventually votes from the Republican incumbent George H.W. Bush. And then you have Bill Clinton there at the debate. So it was a very strange dynamic, a unique dynamic in which you had three candidates on the stage. But the NAFTA debate, which was at the heart of George H.W. Bush's re-election platform, a way to re-stimulate the American economy, generated a lot of controversy well after the 1992 election. And so on the left you see here Al Gore and Ross Perot in a very famous exchange that took place on CNN on a program, Larry King Live, in 1993 as the ratification debate really heated up. But in 1992, during the campaign, the fall of 1992, George H.W. Bush, President Bush, was really pushing Bill Clinton to take a stand on the NAFTA. And what's interesting about this is that Bill Clinton, in classic Bill Clinton fashion, studiously sat on the fence for quite some time. But in October 1992, he finally endorsed the NAFTA, and this is what's important about the environment. He endorsed it, but. So he endorsed the NAFTA, said the NAFTA would be a good thing for jobs, for the American economy, but he wanted protections for the environment and labor. And so that was the beginning of entrenching, formally entrenching, a presidential level endorsement of entrenching labor and environment issues firmly within the trading structure, at least regionally. But it really planted these issues in the minds of everybody thinking about international trade and really solidified them in the global trading agenda. One additional point regarding Bill Clinton's endorsement of labor and the environment in the 1992 campaign as part of the NAFTA debate was that he proposed a couple of side agreements. And these side agreements were a way for him to mollify domestic constituents, particularly in his own party, who were concerned about the relationship between trade and labor in the environment, the impact of trade on the environment. And so what Clinton proposed was the addition, a kind of appendix or an addendum to the NAFTA, which became the North American Free Trade Agreement side agreements. So two side agreements on labor and the environment. The one I want to focus on here, of course, is the one on the environment. And the side agreement, the NAFTA side agreement on environmental cooperation, formally created something called the Commission on Environmental Cooperation. And its headquarters are in Montreal. Its logo, as you can see here on the right, is the monarch butterfly. It's the only species that actually migrates between all three NAFTA countries. And so it's kind of an appropriate part of the logoing, the symbolism of the monarch butterfly and the cooperation on environment in North America. But the mandate of the CEC was to increase cooperation on a whole range of shared environmental issues. And you can see this in the preamble of the Environmental Side Agreement, and to encourage domestic enforcement of environmental regulations, environmental laws. And so this was a monumental, it created an institution that was designed to monitor and encourage and foster cooperation among all three countries on environmental issues. Now, this organization was institutionally pretty weak, didn't have any supranational enforcement powers. It couldn't go and tell Mexico or Canada independently to pull its socks up. There is no sort of police force that's going to come and enforce a country's environmental laws or sanctions that could be imposed. But the mere fact that this was an institution that was created within the context of a trade agreement to monitor or encourage the kind of cooperation on the environment that many advocates had been arguing for years and years was very profound. Now, I mentioned that the CEC, the environmental side agreements and the CEC that were created, very important in terms of the institutionalization of the management of environment and trade, except that the institution itself is very weak in terms of its supranational capacities. There's no enforcement power. A very good example of this is with respect to federalism and the ability of federal governments to impose or force the cooperation on environmental issues with their NAFTA neighbors. A good example here is the Annex 41, the sort of the carve-out that Ottawa took with respect to trying to apply the environmental side agreements to Canadian provinces. As many of you know, the Canadian Constitution spells out areas of jurisdiction, and provinces have tremendous authority over natural resource extraction. And so Ottawa was a little uncomfortable with trying to forcibly apply some of this cooperative mandate within the CEC to its provinces. And so they insisted on this Annex 41 that if you look at, Canada will do its best, Ottawa will do its best to get the provinces to adhere to the terms of the agreement, but they can't make any promises. That said, one of the most interesting things about the NAFTA is the way that it really did permanently entrench the environment as part of the global trading regime. And in part, the robustness of the CEC, the environmental provisions of the side agreements, the longevity of those provisions is really what's impressive here. So the institution itself might be weak in terms of enforcement power, but the mere fact that the CEC lives on and has become a really important focal point, a forum for the exchange of shared environmental transborder species issues, environmental degradation, scientific information. Epistemic communities come together at the CEC and talk about shared watersheds, shared cross-border migrations of species, and so on. It's become an important forum for the exchange of information and, in part, the shaming of governments to take action. And so it's become more robust than any of the three governments in 1993-94 could have possibly envisioned. It was envisioned as a relatively weak organization institutionally, something with no supranational enforcement powers that could dictate or tell states what to do. And yet it has become, on its own, evolved into something that's far more robust than any of the governments actually envisioned. One of the other really interesting things about the CEC is that nothing like it has made its way into other trade agreements, other regional trade agreements that any of the three NAFTA countries have concluded since 1994. After 1994, Canada, the United States, and Mexico all went around the world concluding bilateral or regional trading arrangements with other countries. But none of those agreements concluded by any of the three NAFTA countries have anything like the CEC alongside it, even as an annex or an appendix. None of those agreements subsequent to the NAFTA included anything like the CEC. And so the CEC is really a unique institution. As weak as it was designed, it's become far more robust. And at least through the early 2000s, there was a reluctance on the part of all three NAFTA countries to produce something similar in their subsequent trade agreements after the NAFTA. Now, that said, it's not as if the environment fell off the table in the negotiations that Canada, the United States, and Mexico embarked upon in other parts of the world. A good example of the evolution of the environment, the growing importance of the environment in the context of trade negotiations, regional trade negotiations, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Some of you may know that the United States pulled out of this, the Trump administration pulled out of this in early 2017. But what's interesting about the language around the environment inside the Trans-Pacific Partnership text is its evolution. You can see the kind of genesis of the language in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement as it's evolved from the NAFTA. And so in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there's no separate institution like the CEC proposed within the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but you can see throughout the agreement all kinds of language flagging the inappropriateness of manipulating or weakly enforcing environmental rules for the purposes of trade, expanding trade, for the purposes of artificially allowing your firms to pollute the environment, get away with all kinds of lax regulatory enforcement just for the purposes of trade, manufacturing, and so on. And there's now a long list of norms or markers within all of these agreements around things like maritime ship pollution, corporate social responsibility, trade and biodiversity, invasive species. You can find references to these kinds of issues throughout the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and many other trade agreements that have been negotiated since 1994. Now, one of the most surprising things to me about the Trump administration, at least in its first couple of years, really does concern the environment. As many of you know, the NAFTA was recently renegotiated and has reemerged as something called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, kind of a mouthful, the USMCA. But what's remarkable to me is that anything connected to the environment survived. I was shocked to see that the environment is still firmly entrenched as part of the norms around which trade agreements are negotiated. And in fact, the language, the rules, the norms around the environment and environmental protection that were negotiated in the terms of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, remarkably, almost verbatim, found their way into the USMCA. Given the political orientation of the Trump administration, its propensity to kind of destroy things and throw norms out the window, it's very surprising and a sign of the robustness and the necessity to consider the environment alongside trade, that the language of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the Trump administration proudly pulled itself out of, found its way into the environment provisions of the USMCA. And more so, those provisions actually include the CEC as part of the USMCA's monitoring, collaborative cooperation, and encouragement of cooperation among the three countries. In other words, the CEC survives intact and is even more firmly embedded in the new USMCA than even it was as a side agreement of the NAFTA. Finally, make no mistake that even though the CEC is now firmly entrenched once again in North American governance of trade and the norms around environmental protection and cooperation are reaffirmed by the fact that the CEC lives on and is embedded in the USMCA, the USMCA is still strongly statist. Sovereignty is still a major component of the governance structures of the USMCA. So under the USMCA, the CEC, the Council, the Commission on Environmental Cooperation, is given no additional enforcement powers, But as I mentioned earlier, in the evolution of the NAFTA and the robustness and the longevity of the CEC, the mere fact of its survival in the current political environment, the populist politics of the Trump era, is remarkable. And so the CEC lives on, and it'll be very interesting in the next several years to learn and to see how the CEC evolves within the new modernized USMCA as the norms and principles around which trade and the environment have evolved over the last 20, 25 years continue to evolve and continue to perhaps become even more robust in the years ahead.